we're well on our way to having 1.4 million deaths around the world, making this pandemic the deadliest pandemic in over 100 years. We have had two pandemics in the last century beyond the 1918 pandemic, flu pandemic, and the death totals, if you can call it that, the loss of life was 1.1 million in one case and 1 million in a second case. They took place in the 1950s and the 1960s. And the United States lost far fewer than 100,000 people in each one of those cases. Today, the United States is approaching 260,000 deaths. And the world death total is, as I said, approaching 1.4 million. It is important for us to understand that we're not anywhere near gaining control of the pandemic. We have had some good news, all of them in the last week or so. And the good news are that two of the vaccines being developed, the one jointly with a German biotech firm, the other one an American firm on its own, that appear to be able to deal or protect 95% of the participants. And both of these are going to ask for an emergency right to distribute the vaccine, and all indications are that that will be granted. So as a result, we have hope. Unfortunately, for most people, the time between getting this emergency right license to actually distribute the vaccines and the time that most people will be able to have access to those vaccines is going to be about 6 or 7 or 8 months. So we're in for a very hard winter and a fairly hard early spring and full spring. So in order for us to be able to do better in terms of the outcomes for us, people, our families, our friends, we have to do all of the things that we know make all the difference. Let me be perhaps controversial and say that almost regardless what our political leaders have done or have failed to do, the biggest enablers of the recurring crisis is us. It is people. It is people who are not really listening to the experts, who are breaking the rules, who have some sort of a narrative that this is about freedom. People who have and say so, who are fatigued and who are worried about all of those things that government, apparently, according to them, seems to be doing to them. And I think it's essential that we move off of this narrative and instead have, follow the rules. They're fairly simple. Now, what about borders and mobility? During the height of the first phase, almost all countries around the world closed their borders. Mobility ground to a halt. And after the first phase of the pandemic, as late as August and early September of this year, still over 70 countries continue to have their borders closed. For the rest of the countries, particularly the Europeans, but other parts of the world, there were tentative reopenings of borders. And indeed, as a result of that, movement, including migration, refugee resettlement, acceptance to adjudicate asylum applications, etc., sort of started to flow again. Of course, the last month or so, Europe has been in an even harder place than the United States is now, in the sense that the number of deaths, which is, one of the ultimate measures, but before you get there, hospitalizations, of course, is what it is that we need to look at rather than the number of infections. When you look at those things, you realize that something did not work out. And that something also includes slight mutations of the virus, which is something that troubles epidemiologists very, very much. So borders sort of opened a bit. Mobility sort of, resumed a little bit. But the last 4 weeks, most of these countries have had to sort of pull back. And the challenge that they and every country around the world faces is very simply this: how can you reopen the economy? How do you slowly reopen the borders? How do you go back to having some mobility while at the same time protecting yourself and your population from the ravages of this particular disease, this particular virus? And this is really the challenge that everybody is facing. Now, as we all know, we will have a new administration in the United States. And, this is going to be an administration that's more forthright with and direct with American citizens. And we are going to have much more cooperation with other countries. But at the end of the day, to repeat what I said a few minutes ago, we have to do our part. It is essential that each one of us, does his or her part. It is also essential that we listen to the people who make, informed decisions, that we do not get involved in the fact that New Zealand has sort of conquered the virus, because we shouldn't forget that New Zealand is not only an island nation, but it is an island nation over there. And it has a very small population. And it closed and shuttered both its economy and its borders to mobility throughout most of the past 8 or 9 months. Nor should we be comparing ourselves to Taiwan, because Taiwan is a highly disciplined society. Again, it's us who enable the virus to spread. And that kind of sort of ability on the part of people to follow the rules is a big, big plus in trying to defeat the spread of the virus. In a month or so, we will have many, many, many different vaccines. But in trying to see, what is the efficacy of these machines? What other things do we need to be doing as societies, as scientists? They're going to have to tell us what else we need to do in order to protect ourselves. So I imagine in about a month's time, by the end of the year, certainly, that borders will sort of open a bit more, ajar. And the reason for that is very simple for me. Having sort of thought about these things for, a year or a decade or few. If we have tests that give reliable results within 15 minutes, and one was just, approved. But let's say within 8 hours, people can take the test before they jump on an airplane. And if need be, they can take another test once they land to a place. So we can have testing that actually will make us feel a little more secure, because in order for travel to resume, not to its earlier period, but to resume slowly and gradually, people must trust that airlines, government, and individuals and families will all follow the rules. The immigrants, the foreign-born person who are in our countries. I don't care how they got to the United States, but for the last year, this entire year, they really bore the brunt of this virus. They have contributed, they have worked, they're the frontline workers. We need to make sure that everybody, all hands are on deck, and everybody contributes as we try to dig ourselves out of this vast hole that this virus has dug for all of us. Distribution is going to be the soft underbelly of this, the whole thing. And we're going to have distribution problems throughout the world, but distribution in the least developed countries, particularly the ones that are sort of very large, okay, is going to be a problem that may indeed push the pandemic into the next year, meaning after 2021. But I will use a quote that the Deputy Secretary General of the UN put on the table about last May, I believe. He said, if we don't cooperate and pay attention to the needs of people in the least developed countries, the virus will have a boomerang effect. And what a concept, okay? We think that we've taken care of ourselves, and then like a boomerang, it will come back to us as people begin to move again and mobility builds up and migration, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm deeply worried. There has been something similar to what Krish said about India. If you look at Africa with only two exceptions, South Africa and Ethiopia, okay? If you look at the rest of the continent has a remarkably low infection rate and low death rates. Now, a lot of this may have to do, some of it will have to do with the underreporting. Another part will have to do with misreporting, because if you don't start from the beginning, okay, you may have misreported, deaths as something else. Demographers are very good at looking at the situation a year later, estimating how many people would have died in a regular year, and take the difference between how many people actually died and how many would have died. And then we're going to have a better measure of how many people really died in Africa. And for me, most of Asia is a puzzle, because it's not just, India with the conditions that Krish talked about, but, Vietnam has had just a handful of deaths. Thailand has opened up to travel and mobility, et cetera, the last 3 or 4 weeks, and they had a very low caseload. So something is going on in that part of the world that I'm certainly not an expert to be able to discuss and say why. Undocumented migration, as we call it here, irregular migration, as the European, whatever the word, the euphemism is going to take a while before it grows to the levels, let's say, that we had a few years ago. But it's not because people will not try. People will be more and more desperate. I think that Sandy put it, I don't know if she used the same word that I'm about to use, migration has become an essential lubricant, both for migrants, for households and communities from which they come, and to households and communities in which they settle. That's not really going to change. Forget the ugly debates in the United States. These are just ugly debates, and they're fairly ignorant debates, not because people are stupid, because people are promoting a particular political perspective. Okay, so we all know that. So, I suspect that the demand for entering and working in another country will grow exponentially once borders sort of loosen up a bit. We already see that in Europe. We see extraordinary rates of deaths in the Mediterranean, but also in the Atlantic, as people from West Africa are trying to go to the Canary Islands, which is European space. Because in Europe, once you touch European space, you're in Europe. Makes no difference whether you're 500 miles or 5 million miles from, Spain. Okay, so I imagine that we're going to continue to see more and more people trying